Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. These 17 guys who met up for some pizza 20 years ago were teaching us something when they wrote this into the Agile Manifesto, but even they would have never imagined the enormous impact Agile would have. All over the world, from private firms to schools to governments, Agile has been adopted, co-opted, reimagined in dozens of different ways. But at the heart of it all, in its most purest form, it really comes down to these basic elements. We're continuing our special series of interviews exploring Agile and the effect it has had in the technology industry, as well as right here at Voyager. Today, my guest is Tim Phillips. He is an independent Agile coach and a software practice lead at Voyager. In the last 20 years, Tim has seen it all. We discuss Agile coaching, consulting, experimentation at Pixar, working in India, and a pretty crazy Red Bull weekend. Agile has been, since the manifesto was written 20 years ago, a lot's changed, things have evolved, but you've been in this industry for 20 years yourself, if not a little bit more. So I'd like to just ask you, how did you start in this, in technology, and if you can walk me through a little bit about that story.
Yeah, sure. So I guess for me, I've been sort of using Agile ways of working and just Agile ways of thinking for probably the better part of 20 years. And it's not something that I consciously did. It's not, a blog post that I read. It's just, having worked for small, medium, large sort of startups and stuff, you've got to be quite resourceful. And quite often what I find, sort of in the contracting space is quite often there's things that pop up to block you. So, just sort of being somewhat more agile and the ability to sort of be open to change and sort of responding to changes within that is sort of taught me to, I guess, think and be and sort of act differently. But what I'm finding now is that there is a lot more, I'm seeing a lot more people, sort of doing those same things, versus sort of 5, 10, sort of 15 years ago.
I guess 5, 10, or even 15 years ago, where did you find yourself? What were you doing then?
15 years ago. So I just, I think I'd probably just cashed out of a startup that I started with some friends that we started in early 2000 and just sort of setting up my own consulting business, which, as you know, has got a funny name. And
why don't you tell us about that a little as well? Unfuddle, right? I actually saw it and I thought, unfuddle. That means you're trying to get out of a fuddle. What's a fuddle? Maybe talk to that a little bit.
Yeah. So I guess, for me, I've been sort of involved in technology for the better part of 20 years, worked for a number of sort of service providers, as I mentioned, startups, and a lot of what I've done in the last sort of 15 years has heavily been in sort of the hosting space. But what I've found is that quite often engineering teams or groups of people aren't necessarily operating at the level that they could be. And what my consulting business is around is about sort of reorganizing people and teams and sort of equipping them with sort of tools and processes around sort of Agile and Scrum, sort of lean methodologies, and sort of more in the last sort of 5 to 10 years is sort of that DevOps, so sort of trying to break down silos within teams and getting a better sort of cross-pollination with with people and what they can do to sort of contribute towards a product or a sort of a vision within a team.
Is that hard when you're going into organizations as an outsider or as a contractor going into these organizations to see who's actually on board and who's not?
It definitely can be, and one of the things that I think can either strengthen or break, sort of the agile transformation within companies is sort of that buy-in, and particularly the buy-in with the people and the buy-in, all through the organization, especially from the executives and sort of leadership within the businesses. some of the more forward-looking businesses that I see, that's where they really care about thinking and operating differently, and they can actually see that maybe they're not accelerated to the level that they could be. A lot of these companies have incredibly talented people, but they've just sort of been doing things the way that they've always done them, and as a result now sort of expecting some sort of a different outcome. But yes, I do find that it can sort of vary, and there can be some sort of change resistance, but I think you almost get that anywhere. But particularly when you're setting out to specifically transform the way that people work, sometimes you do get that resistance. But them being able to see what they're doing and what the value is that they're going to sort of derive at the end, I think that can be quite empowering for people that do think differently.
Absolutely. You mentioned there was a quote when we talked earlier. You said, "What got us here won't get us there." And it's just stuck with me, and I absolutely love it. Can you talk a little bit on maybe where that came from and how you've incorporated that in your own practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So in 2016, 2017, I was doing quite a lot of work for a company called Namecheap.com. They're one of the largest ICANN accredited domain registrars, and I was incredibly fortunate to work directly with the COO, a guy called Halan Klein, and Namecheap at the time was, I think, around 400 or 500 people, all sort of geographically distributed. So we did something, I think it was every sort of 3 or 4 weeks, called a virtual town hall, where they'd get everyone together and we'd run through this thing called a balanced scorecard and see where we were versus where we think we were, supposed to get to. And one of the things that he positioned and sort of pushed it was what got us here won't get us there. And like you, that really stuck for me as well. It sort of really resonated that sometimes we try and use the same processes, the same, approaches to try and just continually change, but they don't sort of yield that change that we need. And sometimes I find, particularly because I'm incredibly passionate around sort of process optimization, is the fact that if it's not working, you need to sort of down tools figure out what is working, what isn't working, and what we can do moving forward. So I think, what got us here won't necessarily get us there. It sort of really encapsulates that sort of mindset and that thinking. And I've tried to share that with, the team at Voyager, particularly around, the sort of the agile transformation that we've been doing, that there's going to be some things that yes, they will continue to work, but there's going to be some things that we'll need to challenge and figure out whether they're still relevant in 2020, 2021.
Yeah, well, a lot's changed. I mean, even in the last few months. Do you find that with Voyager's own journey, you've had the advantage of being able to plan what the future could look like and then work towards it? Have you had that kind of ability to do that here?
Yeah, so I guess sort of going back to where I started in 2019, we knew that we had a group of people in technology that were very silo based. We had people around sort of network and system and development and voice, and they operated in very much of a vertical silo. And as a result of that, we wanted to sort of group them into these product teams. So the initial vision for that was to be able to group these people around the product, was to use Scrum as a framework to sort of provide them a facility to do their work. It gave them a sort of a cadence for their work, and it gave them mechanisms to sort of look back on things that are working and aren't working, and sort of plan. And it gave us a way to sort of forecast the amount of work that these teams might be able to do on a 2 weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly basis. And I think what we were looking at there is we were just literally looking at what can we do to transform the operating mode of these teams initially, and then the next evolution, which we hadn't necessarily discussed at that starting point, was the evolution of sort of tribes at Voyager. So I think if I was to look back, I think if I was to sort of outlay a very specific path, I think that might have forced us to do things differently. We took more of an organic approach, and as the business requirements were emerging, and the dynamics within the team, we were sort of looking at how do we get them to the next level? How do we sort of take the teams forward? So yeah, I think the sort of the coaching and the sort of that specifically in the agile coaching space, each instance that I've had where I've come into an organization. They've been at different maturities. They've been at different paths, different requirements. Some even in different industries. So therefore, what I could use in one might not directly sort of transpose one for one to the likes of Voyager. So it's very much been around the people, the process, and the product.
That reminds me. There was a book in the library, the Agile Library, Creativity Inc. And I really liked how, it really centered around the people and their passion. Can you talk a little bit about what you took from that, maybe in terms of what is practical and could be applied really organizations wide? Given that they were Pixar, so they're very creative, animations based. Just magical kind of, bringing that magic. But how did they use, these methods?
So I think they've been very much like us, that they've started from a specific point and they just keep iterating. But I think the thing that is so incredible about Pixar is that they look to be using agile ways of working, all the way back then, when they first started. And I think one of the key things that keeps them open is building a really supportive culture around communication. I don't know if you've sort of remember back to the book, but they're sort of talking about the brain trust when they bring people together, and they're
I thought that was great. The brain trust, the idea of bringing the people in.
And Steve Jobs bought them that table. It wasn't a round table, so there were some people that were dominated on one side, and it's just all these things that might be sort of metaphors, but they have a massive culture around experimentation. And one of the things that my son, as he was growing up, he really loved those Pixar short movies. And as I was reading through the book, it dawned on me that they were using those as experiments because they were very, very cheap to get started. And if it didn't pan out, then they didn't really lose a lot of money versus a feature film. So, there's a lot of stuff that we can take from that, and we can use those approaches and those mindsets in what we do day to day. But we have a book club that was started by Daniel Stastny, who I think you've already
That's right. Yeah, we had him on the podcast.
Yeah. So he sort of started this book club. So I think we have 1 or 2 books that we read per quarter as a team, and then we come together and we sort of talk about those. And this was one of those books that really captivated each of us. And the amount of points that we had sort of talking about that and drawing parallels to where Voyager is and Agile, and the ways, the challenges that we have with the teams, and the potential opportunities that we have with the teams, and it's incredibly fascinating. But the thing that I like the most about it is they're so far removed from a technology company as the heart. Yeah, sure, all of their stuff is 3D animation, it's all done on computers, but you don't necessarily think of them as a technology company. They're a movie entertainment vehicle. Yeah,
I like that. And because the idea, abstraction from the technology to really deliver on something that is of absolute value to the end consumer, that the people actually taking it in, whether it's a movie or not. How have you taken that approach or those kind of ideas with your own coaching and developing teams?
That's a good point. So one of the things today is we've got an initiative in First Domains where we're trying to increase the experience, increase the revenue. And so as part of the Scrum framework, whenever we break our work down for a 2-week period, we try and assign goals around those works. So it's sort of like the North Star of what we want to complete as a team, and we sort of articulate the value that we'll be delivering as part of delivering on that. And one of them was, and they might seem incredibly small, but there's some some experiments that we're starting to run, and I think it's the first time that we've really started to use that experimental mindset. And as part of the sprint goals, we prefix them with growth experiment. So, I think, sort of thinking back to Pixar and those short movies, those are all experiments. There was absolutely no certainty that they would deliver on, but and some of them, that you saw through the brain trust, as far as Creativity Inc. goes in Pixar, some of those movies that started out are far different from, what we actually watch when we go to the movie theater. So
That's right.
Up is a really good example. And I think the other one, I forget what it was in your mind, with the different feelings.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know the one. It'll come to me. And while we struggle to remember the film Inside Out, you can catch us in a minute. Growth is a podcast about people, their stories, their challenges, and how they help to shape technology for all of us. We're producing a special series of episodes to kick off our podcast, dedicated to Voyager's journey into becoming an Agile company. We interview guests who were integral in shaping that journey, and we delve into what it means to be Agile. More with Tim after the break. I think it helps to foster a creative imagination and just an open mind. There's a lot of that I've noticed in the original Agile Manifesto, and putting people over processes, collaboration. I think all of that obviously nurtures trust and a safe environment between the teams. But maybe let's go back to 20 years ago, when things weren't as they weren't as adopted in the conversation as they are today with Agile. I mean, it seems to be a buzzword a lot, but I recall that you told me earlier before the tape, you were there was mention of a Red Bull weekend. Now, perhaps if you could just enlighten us with that story, because I really I think there was something more to that.
Yeah, so I guess if we draw a parallel to, sort of the Agile Manifesto, sort of responding to change. So it was, I think it was 2001, and I was working at i4Free, which was part of Core Plus, owned by Malcolm Dick. And so I think it was like a Friday night or something like that, and we get called into his office, and it turns out that Clear Communications, the partner that they'd been using for terminating calls that would allow customers on the i4Free service to basically have free internet. Clear and Telecom had come to an agreement that it was no longer financially viable, and yada yada. So, long story short, i4Free was basically at a point where it was non-viable as a service. So,
and they were offering dial-up, right?
That's right.
Free
yeah.
dial-up.
So I think DSL broadband was like the new kid on the block, but it was just, I think it was called Jetstream back then. It wasn't even, a thing that most people had access to. But
that's right.
But we were sort of propositioned that, i4Free's sort of dead in the water. We've got a limited time. We need to create an offering. We've got 100 and something thousand customers on this, and we want to turn this into this thing called Slingshot. So, my boss at the time, Wayne Todden, he came in with this tray of Red Bull and said, "You guys, we've got this weekend to sort of turn this around." And we did it. I think there was like a handful of us. Some of them even still work at Core Plus, who basically, helped build Slingshot in a weekend, which is crazy.
That is crazy,
to go from nothing to something, and brand new website, transitional pages to take customers from free to paid and so forth. It was But
you managed to get it done, right?
We did. Yeah, it was probably a bit rough around the edges, but yeah, it was done.
The idea of working so hard, like put together a squad, work really, really hard and just like slog it out for 24, 48 hours straight with Red Bull. That seems, it's definitely not sustainable, but where do you sit with that? And having teams really just like work crazy hours. Like I think there was a mention of that in Creativity Inc. in the book when they were working just round the clock. This was Toy Story, or I think maybe even Toy Story 2. And yeah, it was quite a horrific circumstance where one of the staff members, I think he drove into work, forgot to drop his kid off to school on the way, and left him in the car. And luckily, I think everything was fine. But something like that, when you're overtired, stressed, how would you coach people to overcome that or even avoid that altogether? What's your take on it?
Yeah, so it's definitely something that we try and promote within the teams, is we need to get to a sustainable pace, a sustainable rhythm. We call them sprints, but in essence they're essentially marathons, right? We're playing the long games, so we've got to figure out how much is too much work and how much is not enough. So one of the things that we do is we try and make the work that the teams have to do or committing to do is fully transparent. That we can see it. We understand as much as we possibly can about the work, any knowns, unknowns, anything that's likely to catch us out based on what we've done previously. But I think it's part of that sort of norming, sort of forming sort of situation with the team, that they sort of figure out in the initial instances that some teams, they just take on way too much work. But over time, using those sort of retrospectives and sort of looking back at what we've done before and what's working, what's not, it sort of sets us up with a more realistic expectation of what we can do as a team. And one of the things that we try to do, to keep that velocity within the teams, is we try and not split the teams up and move people around too often, because you become aware of what your team members can do, the sort of limits and limitations that you have within the team. So keeping them relatively static gives us a little bit more certainty. But yeah, it's definitely something that I'm massively passionate about, is making sure that we get the teams to a sustainable pace, because we don't really end up getting that level of creativity out of the teams, and quite often people can lead to burnout and so forth. So just sort of aiming for that sustainable pace, but being able to make it visible what that is. And sometimes it's a number, or sometimes it's it's whatever the team can do to articulate when they're at that right point.
Exactly. And I guess over time they get to know each other and themselves. I think psychological well-being is really important, as you say. Plus, people have families. I mean,
exactly.
You mentioned your son, and I know that through your website and Unfuddle, I believe your partner, your wife, she's obviously involved too. Tell us about her involvement, and maybe how did you first meet? I'd love to know.
Yeah, so we actually met just before the Red Bull weekend.
Oh,
we both worked together
look at
at
that.
Plus. She was the receptionist back then.
No way.
And
Small world.
We just hit it off. So yeah, we've been together for 21 years or something like that. Yeah, so what she brings to the business is, she's really good in the comm space. So she does a lot of proofing. She can generate a lot of content. She handles all of the sort of e-commerce side of, making sure that all the articles that we post on LinkedIn are, cross-posted on various platforms and so forth. But I guess one of the key strengths that she does have is she was one of the early members at TradeMe. So she started on the front line in customer service, and then worked on their phone support. And then at one point she was actually shoulder tapped to take up an opportunity within their software testing team, which was all manual testing at the time. But the real strength that she brought to that was she had a very deep understanding of the business rules around TradeMe and its various systems. So what that meant was that, as she's going about her day-to-day sort of thinking about software testing, as she had such a deep understanding of the product and what was supposed to happen, which I think, is something that quite often isn't really apparent these days. And I'm a massive supporter of promoting internally for these sorts of things. But what she does bring is, as I said, she brings that software testing, and one of the parts where she really supported me, particularly at Namecheap, when I was trying to work with their QA engineering team in India, was was within the space of a couple of days, she built out like a whole several hundred automated tests for them to sort of demonstrate how automated testing could really improve their workflow and sort of time to market. So sort of that DevOps thinking, what can we do to sort of deliver as much value as quickly as possible.
Tell me about your time in India. Then you mentioned with Namecheap. What was that like?
Yeah, so it was a really good opportunity. I think it was 2016, 2017. I did several trips out to southern India, and they had quite a large team there. And most of it was sort of focused around sort of software engineering. There was a few people from sort of product. We'd had an emerging customer service center there. But because of my previous history in the hosting space, I was sort of asked to go out there and just do a bit of an assessment on the team and, any sort of gaps and any training opportunities we have with the team and any ways that we could sort of optimize what we have, which was really, sort of building on the strengths that I have, that I bring through Unfuddle and sort of helping, support at Voyager. But I identified one team that we had there, and this was predating product-focused teams. They were sort of traditionally running product sort of projects per se, and quite often the projects would be delayed. So with the help of a lady who had actually just been sort of promoted to product owner, we assembled a group. I think it was about 8 people. There was a Scrum Master, some software developers, there was QA engineers. Who did we have? There was somebody from a product ownership perspective, and very quickly we sort of scaffolded the first iteration of a product-focused team. And at that point, the company was probably about 500 people. So it's amazing how far companies can go, and then still need reorganization at a certain point. But the feedback that I got was working very closely in a hands-on capacity with these teams was that we took one of the slower performing teams and then we reassembled them. We put all the capabilities in there, all that sort of cross-functionality within the team. We gave them a very specific focus. It was around their hosting portfolio. And the feedback that I was getting within months was that this was immediately one of the higher performing teams. So,
Wow.
Coming back to sort of thinking differently, it was just about reorganizing people. We had the capabilities that we needed. They just weren't grouped effectively and sort of weren't really executing. So that was the sort of forte into Namecheap sort of moving into more product focus. They adopted a framework called SAFe, which is Scaled Agile Framework. It's
right,
really for sort of more of the enterprise space. They're absolutely kicking it. I think 2016 they were like $100 million revenue, and I think 2020 they're over 200. So just that foundation, those dominoes, sort of just moving forwards, slow iterations, looking back and reflecting and moving forward. It was it was a really exciting time for me.
I wonder, how do you, as a coach or a contractor looking from the outside in, how do you see how do you know whether or not a different framework like Scaled Agile or DevOps or Scrum will work within the dynamics of the organization?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I think I've never really walked into any one organization and sort of just prescribed stuff over the counter, so to speak. When I came to Voyager, it was different. They'd obviously decided that Agile was the way that they wanted to go. They wanted to use the Scrum framework and they wanted product-focused teams. So for me, that was more execution mode. It was, what can I do to help sort of, group and coach the Scrum Masters and product ownership and so forth. But yeah, it's been really going in an observation mode into these organizations, figuring out where they are from a maturity point of view, maybe doing a bit of a SWOT assessment to figure out what gaps they have within, and sort of formulating a plan from there.
Right. I wonder, just before we wrap, I'd like to know, 20 years now we've been more or less trying to fumble our way through Agile, and finally we're at this point. But what is in store, do you think, for the next 20 years, or even 10, 5? I mean, things are changing so quick, right? But
Yeah.
What do you think we have to look ahead to?
So I think, and maybe some of these things are more sort of on the technology side, but I think there's a lot of emergence in the sort of low code, no code space. So these people are looking at sort of Zapier and integrations, and you don't necessarily need to be a technical person to be able to connect system A to system B and to be able to improve your workflow. I've seen some very large businesses now that are sort of supported by very few people. I mean, if we look back at Instagram, they were a $1 billion company. When they sold, there was 13 people. How is that possible? So it's through thinking differently, and I think there's going to be a heavy move into sort of more cloud services, and particularly in that DevOps space. I think that the sort of the lines between sort of system engineering and sort of development is going to be sort of merging a bit closer, because they're going to find that they're able to sort of cross-pollinate within that, and there's sort of a better use of services. I think there's going to be a bit sort of this sort of Wizard of Oz thing. People don't really care what's behind the curtain. They're sort of prescribing to a platform. They sort of push their workloads. They sort of use that, and we're seeing a lot of that. With zero hardware and stuff like that. People just prescribe to cloud services as a utility model. Some of them used to be sort of, you'd pay daily, and then it went to hourly, and, some is minutely, and some is even billed by the second. So, that sort of serverless architecture. But there's a company called Fathom Analytics. They pride themselves on being a very tight team. I think there's only sort of 2 or 3, but they're sort of like, privacy focused Google Analytics. But, the guy has done a whole write-up of their business and how they leverage sort of the cloud platform, and they've been able to sort of leverage DevOps. And as a result of that, they don't need a whole lot of people to to sort of run their business. And last week, Rackspace said that they're moving into this thing called elastic engineering. So previously you just think about being able to prescribe to cloud infrastructure, but they're doing that with people now. So if you want an architect for for a day, an hour, you can prescribe to that. And so I think that's thinking differently. That's sort of moving into the future, seeing that people may not want or see the value in having permanent architecture teams established. They may need to do them on a prescription model. I think there's still going to be a lot around machine learning and AI. There's this platform called kite.com. It's an editor that can almost predict what sort of code you're going to fill in as you sort of use the editor. It's amazing how that stuff works. And there's Deep Code that uses AI to perform code analysis, analytics over your sort of merge requests and things like that. So I think they're looking very much from a security focus, but having systems behind the scenes doing that, rather than people that may not add specific value to that space. I think, and we use a tool called New Relic, which is embedded sort of AI in the application alerting. So it's sort of looking at, the alarms that your systems generate and figure out whether that's an anomaly or an outlier and things like that. So sort of heavily, sort of machine learning and AI focused. And I think for me, the last part that I see is around this sort of CX DX space. So this customer experience, and something that I've been sort of pushing for years is sort of developer experience as well, is making sure that we're getting the right experiences for everyone that's using and building the platforms and services that we have. I know that Voyager's kicked off a big customer experience review, based on feedback, and we're heavily invested in just improving that experience, and whether that's sort of an individual interaction, or whether that's purchasing services or logging faults, or however it is, it's really important. And I think that's what's going to set the likes of Voyager ahead of some of our competitors.
Absolutely. Out of interest, we're talking about the future, and you mentioned your son. What do you think is in his future in terms of that technology, and does he have an interest in even what you do or that sort of thing?
Well, he wants to be an influencer on YouTube, and I'm on the fence on that one.
Of course. Better money.
No, he's I mean, the thing is, he's 12. Unreal Engine is available that they use to build games. they've made it incredibly easy to actually build stuff, and it cross-compiles to different platforms, to different consoles. So he's in a different world than I was, when I was growing up. And as a result of that, he could literally, not sort of promoting this, but I mean, he could literally skip school. He's good at graphics, he's good at audio. He could probably build a game and sell it on an app, platform like the App Store, Apple App Store, or Android Store.
Absolutely.
These things just
were
not available to us before. So there's a lot of opportunity if you see opportunity. And again, it's just about thinking differently. Who would have thought that you could be building your own games at home on a modern computer and publishing it around the world, and overnight have hundreds of thousands of people purchasing it or using it.
I know. Hey, you know what? Maybe there's a Red Bull weekend in his future. You never know. Tim, I want to thank you so much for being on Growth Podcast. And it's just been a pleasure speaking with you.
Cool. Thank you. You too.
You've been listening to the Growth Podcast, a production from Voyager Internet. My name is Christian Espinoza. The show was produced, edited, and mixed by me. Special thanks to my guest, Tim Phillips. Stay tuned for our next episode in our Agile series. If you liked this episode and would like to hear more, just subscribe to us from your podcast app. We feature interviews with the people behind the computer screens, and we learn a bit about them, their background, and even their love for energy drinks, especially on long weekends, so I'm told. Until next time, peace.